Okay, so today is Greensock, the animation library, GSAP. It's Greensock animation potato. I got told off before for kind of oversimplifying what it does, so I need to be very clear this time. But Greensock is basically a very comprehensive animation library in JavaScript that lets you do all kinds of clever things using WebGL and Canvas, and all kinds of DOM manipulation could be used in all kinds of animations and games and interactive elements. I want to focus though on the CSS specific elements and the way that you can do DOM manipulations with CSS animations in JavaScript. So I'd said in a previous video about CSS animations that it kind of often is overblown. The majority of instances where you need an animation in CSS will probably be a very simple UI event, so a fade, a pop, a spin, a really kind of simple bit of feedback for a user that something's been clicked or something's hovered. And the scenario in which you have something very complex where things are jumping and spinning and running around a page are kind of not massively required or very rarely actually used on websites, other than kind of to demonstrate that it's possible. And as a result, it's often easier to skip the kind of building out the big animation sequence. It's easier to just make a simple transition effect, and it will often achieve the majority of things you needed to do. But that needn't necessarily be a limitation, and people probably should be trying to make web pages more exciting and more animated, and finding opportunities to build in kind of interactive animatable events. So your question is, when would Greensock make sense? When would it make sense to bolt in this big library and start having JavaScript take over when you can already write your own animations in CSS? The truth really is just about the limitations on CSS animations and the problems you might quickly run into. Greensock is able to then fill those gaps and make it a lot more manageable. Let's imagine, for instance, you have two animations that need to run one after the other. So this animation is going to take 2 seconds. When that animation finishes, the second one starts. The way you generally do that in CSS is you just set like a 2-second delay on that second animation, and that will generally work, but it's like you've just coincidentally got them to work, as in this one runs and this one runs after 2 seconds and this one lasts 2 seconds, so they sort of work, but there's no intrinsic link between those two. Those two don't really have any context of one another, and if you change one of those values and don't update the delay, then they're going to overrun. So anything you've got with any kind of scale and complexity is going to quickly kind of become quite messy. Or imagine a scenario where there's a bit of JavaScript and CSS working together. So if you want an event where someone clicks, it runs an animation of a tick or something, and then transitions to the next route. Well, the JS is going to handle the router, but it's going to need to have a delay built in to let the animation run first. So that means that the JavaScript page is going to have to keep a reference of how long the animation lasts, and then the CSS file is also going to need a delay or a animation duration property to know how long to run for. So now you've got a property being stored in CSS and in JavaScript. Again, that's just not being shared between the two. You could update one and not the other. And you're just hoping that the page happens to run in sync and everything runs fluid. The animation finishes before the route changes. There's kind of just a loose binding of those two things. Making complex animations involves adding functionality, which is not something that CSS is particularly strong at. Imagine something with an animation of a walking animal in which you need the head, the legs, the arms, and then the whole body to animate separately but at the same time. You've got some sort of grouping of combinations. This means you're going to need to kind of group different things but also control a parent-child relationship. There's all kind of complexities about when a property overwrites its child properties and so on. There's also the ability to iterate over a series of values, which you can't easily do in CSS, maybe some preprocessor, but you'd have to know what those values are ahead of time. If you're taking data from an API and you need to animate maybe all the characters in a text, you don't know what length that text is going to be, it's going to be very hard to do that in CSS. Or something like randomness. You want every time the animation to run to work slightly differently. Really isn't an easy way to do that in CSS to generate a genuinely random number. Generally, anything that runs into functionality, when you want to start being clever and doing something much more advanced, CSS is going to quite quickly run into problems. So at this point, something like Greensock is a massive boost. It's going to be a massive solution to all those problems. So here's an example of a quick Greensock animation I did in CodePen. It is a little CodePen demo itself. So HTML bars show, a box renders, then the CSS bars show, it adds some styles, and then finally the JS bars makes it kind of jump and pop and function. This is a particularly good use case because it involves a series of different animations of different elements in areas, but all having to have a tangential link, that one has to happen before the next. If you look at this block on the right, it's the start animation, which is just those HTML bars at the top and then the box fading into view. So this start function, which is the opening bit, which just shows the bars for the HTML and then that box fading in the beginning of the animation. It's really straightforward to write here. So I can use a query selector to just grab all the spans for those bars. Then I can do a for each to just apply the same animation to each without having to kind of specify it in CSS. I can literally make them random, so each time this animation runs, those bars will all be different lengths every time. It'll be some random number between 50 and 120. And then I can use the simple GSAP2 function, which just basically says this is where I want you to get to. Over a duration I've set, go to whatever that random width is, and also I can set a delay on the iterator, so I know that each line will come straight after the next one because of it's functionally built in. So I've got a very solid reliability of my delays, meaning that the animation will run exactly as expected. Underneath it, I can then grab that logo box that I want to fade in. So it's a simple animation opacity 1. I can set the delay to be the length of all those spans above it, so I know that as soon as they've all finished, I can then do the next step. I can set a duration and then an on complete, meaning that when this animation is finished running, then trigger the next function. So I have an absolute certainty that these things are going to run exactly in the order as specified, rather than just setting a bunch of delays and just hoping that one happens to run exactly as this one finishes. So this is really just the first playthrough. I've never really got to use Greensock, but I just found it such a smooth thing to be able to refer to the docs quite quickly. If you're coming from writing CSS animations, it just seems like quite intuitive to be able to just plug in the things you need. And really, if you're doing any kind of complicated animation, I can't see why you wouldn't want to use something like Greensock. It just seems so much, it just seems like it doing all the legwork for you makes it so much smoother and easier to work with. The only kind of caveat I could think of is that in 10 years or so of building different websites and applications, I can really only think of maybe 1 or 2 scenarios where this would really be required, because as I say, most of the time you don't need many complicated animations, and that's just my particular experience. So there's certainly nothing where you need lots of chained animations or things to run in certain ways. But it's not really a criticism of the library, it's just it's gives you so many options, and maybe that's just a challenge for developers to try and build more complexity into things to be more creative. Anyway, yeah, it's a big thumbs up from me, and I definitely recommend getting involved with Greensock if you want to experiment with some animations and things much more advanced. Let me know what you think though in the comments, and yeah, give it a go, Greensock.